Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We have a very special webcast for you today, Boosting Support, Realigning Work Practices to Support Employees and Teams. I'm Deb Cohen, a Distinguished Principal Research Fellow here with the Conference Board. And today, in our session, we're going to explore people-focused strategies that acknowledge the disruption of the work landscape and to help inform new patterns of employee and team support. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. This webcast is approved for HRCI, SHRM, and CPE credits. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and click the link in the CEU request pod to sign up for available credits for the event. The pod is located in the bottom right corner of the webcast console. Remember, please stay logged in for the entire webcast and respond to 3 pop-ups throughout the program in order to get your credits. Now, to get the most out of this webcast and to make sure that you utilize the engagement tools, they're located at the bottom of your screen. And using these, you can ask questions to the presenters and also to download any available resources that we may have. Now, please go ahead and join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Kubas-Wilkinson, head of the U.S. consultancy at the Myers-Briggs company. Rachel, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Deb, and welcome everybody to the session. I count it a personal honor that you are investing this time and letting me kind of enter your homes, your offices, and talk about a really important topic. So as Deb mentioned, my name is Rachel. My role is head of consultancy with the Myers-Briggs company. The reason that's relevant here is because I think I can share with you some of what I've been hearing from clients in the last year or so, everything related to challenges that they're experiencing, to ways that we've been addressing those challenges. So I hope that you're going to find something very useful from today's session. And with that, let's jump right in. So as Deb mentioned, section 1 of what I want to look at is really state of the workplace. And the reason for this is because we really kind of need to know what is the current context that we're working with as it relates to employee needs. So the title of the session is about realigning to better support employee and teams. What are we realigning to? So that's really kind of what we're going to cover in this particular session. So let's kick it right off. As a reminder, you're going to get copies of the slides, so don't worry about jotting statistics down that you see. Just kind of sit back, enjoy, maybe take some notes of anything that you want to take back to your organization. So quick look at where we started off last year. We kicked off the year with us being told 40% of employees are thinking about leaving their jobs. And whoa, that was staggering to us because we had just come out of a mass exodus in 2020. Now, how did that actually turn out? Well, unfortunately, it was indeed true, and workers quit in unprecedented numbers. And we faced a couple of challenges in knowing what this challenge actually was. For example, some folks thought, okay, the attrition is easing. 2021 will end better than it started. Unfortunately, that was not true. Folks also thought maybe this is limited to particular industries where folks are in burnout and they're being overworked, right? Healthcare industries, essential workers. Again, that was misguided. That wasn't true. And then finally, we made some assumptions around, well, maybe it's certain workers in certain job categories that are finding it easier to move around. And we ended up finding that everything from customer-facing roles all the way up to execs and professional roles, they were all actively or passively job hunting, get this, at roughly the same rate, which is fascinating. So what this culminated to then is by November of last year, we were at a 20-year high of a quit rate for US, and we created a massive scarcity, 10.1 million job openings. As if that sort of wasn't challenging enough, what has happened between November and now is the fact that those job openings have increased. In fact, when you look at how many job openings that were available in January of last year versus January of this year, exponential growth, 55% more job openings. And what that means, we continue to outpace the availability of people to put in those roles. And so what ended up happening is we have, and I love Polak's statement here. It is by many measures the tightest labor market we have ever seen. Certainly in my generation, it definitely is. And what it's actually done for a lot of companies is it's led to this sort of situation, kind of like we see in the real estate market, right? Where I don't envy anybody having to buy a house right now. Well, that's kind of how it is with the labor market. It's very much where the employees know they kind of have this upper hand, and companies have been waging war against this, doing what they can to raise wages, look for new perks, do what they can to attract and keep employees. What's challenging about this, though, is that it comes at a real cost. It comes at a cost for organizations of really all sizes. So, for example, Gallup was sharing that when you lose your best people, so imagine folks who have deep knowledge about your company already. They're your reliable winners, your constant innovators, your effective problem solvers. When they leave the organization to go look for something else, we know from statistics that the cost of replacing them, if you even can find somebody like that, is pretty expensive, right? SHRM quantifies it at 6 to 9 months of their salary. EBM did a similar quantifiable analysis where if the role is making $36K entry level, it's going to take about a third of that to find that replacement. So if you kind of keep moving up, if you're replacing a people manager, an executive leader, anybody making around $150,000 a year, you're going to invest a whopping $50,000 to try to find a replacement for that role. And that really does put a financial strain on organizations. But where my heart kind of goes out to is that day-to-day work and team impact. So as I put this up, some of you who have not left, right, like maybe like me, you're starting to say, oh gosh, how do I quantify the pressures that I'm feeling, right? So how do you quantify people managers who have lost so many folks? What are they experiencing? All kinds of things, loss of productivity, institutional knowledge and history has up and left the organization. People that had deeply rooted internal networks for knowing who to go to, knowing how to get things done. All of a sudden, that's not there. There's a great reshuffling of team members. Another situation that I think we're facing is, and we know this from research, it's harder to do cross-team collaboration sometimes in this pandemic era that we're living in. That gets even worse with so many folks who have entered and left the organization. And then this one's a big one for me. I've been on so many calls with clients recently who say, I talk to a people manager and they'll say something like, I have a great team, but now it's a great team plus 2 people or 3 people or 4 people, or I had a great team, but I lost 1 or 2, 3 folks. And I have to remind them, the team fundamentally changed when one person left or one person entered. There's a complete reforming, right? Restorming, renorming of the team. The team morale changes. There's a total disruption to the ecosystem of the way that your team function. So when you bring a new person on, you don't have a great team plus 1, you have a brand new team. Right? And then there's sort of these psychological distresses that folks are facing from having seen layoffs and people that headed out to lingering feelings of unease for sure. And then I think there's that unquantifiable change sometimes that when we bring in new people, as excited as we are about their experience, as excited as we are that we were able to recruit them, we don't often quantify how they change the culture, how they change the teams as they're coming in. Are they feeling welcome, recognized, included? Are they making more imprints and changes on the culture? And then this one is particularly funny to me, but I've noticed a lot of folks who kind of have lost some of their best performers, and unfortunately, they've now become competitors, right? They've now gone to companies where they are in direct competition with the company that they were in before. Let's sort of keep looking at this because I think retention and attrition is a big enough issue by itself, but I think here's what's compounding it. And that's the reality that we still don't really have answers for all of the factors that are driving this mass exodus. In fact, this was something that really took us off guard. And when I talk to a lot of leaders recently, a lot of them sort of say, well, I think folks are leaving because of, and the because of that they give me tends to be reasons that maybe people left in the past, maybe pre-pandemic, or they might sort of prescribe reasons around, well, I think it's because we're not keeping up with pay, in the local, in the other environment or in the marketplace. But the truth is there's been very little investigation that employers have done to be able to answer this question. What are people running from and what are they running to? And by not having that answer, there's quite a bit of research that shows that we're putting our businesses at pretty significant risk in doing so. Now, that kind of talks a little bit about the people who have left, right? So we would hope that the people who stay are doing great, but unfortunately, that's also not the case. So as we continue the discussion of state of the workplace, the truth is that workplace issues are growing even for existing, not just exiting employees. And really the crux of this is this growing sense of discontentment. So Gallup came out with this research, and it shows kind of two pieces of information. You'll notice it. I tried to zoom it out for you a little bit. The green bar is showing those are the folks who are actively engaged at your organization. That number is dropping pretty significantly from about 2020 consistently. The blue number, which we don't want, that's active disengagement, that number is rising year over year from 2020 to 22. A really big problem, and we're going to quantify it in just a moment, but this is the staggering statistic that I sort of want us to realize. Whether you're keeping folks, whether folks are leaving, those who are staying, 66% of them are saying, I'm not feeling engaged at work. And that is such a big number. That alone tells us we have so much work to do. And then similar to the issues with understanding why people are leaving, Gallup also said, here's the challenge with disengagement. It's that folks might think it's specific to a single industry. It must be healthcare. It must be the restaurant business. They've gone through so many issues. And the truth is that's not the case. It's a workplace issue. It's actually not even a pay issue per se. Table stakes like pay, 401k matching, etc. We'll talk about those in a bit, but they are no longer the sort of drawing carrot that we might have expected them to be some time ago. So let's keep going. Let's look at the cost of disengagement. This is a really big one. I think folks generally agree they don't want disengaged employees, but ask yourself maybe, how much of this do you want? Do you want 69% higher absenteeism? Do you want 18% less productivity? Do you want folks who commit more work defects and errors and put others at risk? 60% more errors, 49% more workplace accidents? And do you want folks who are disengaged treating your customers, right? And actually increasing the number of customer complaints, reducing customer satisfaction. And then this one's a really big one. If you're a people manager and you've joined us today, one person's bad attitude on the group, in the team, can reduce the team's performance by 30 to 40%. That is huge. So think about that, because if 66% of us are disengaged, think of the ripple effect that this is actually causing. And then sometimes that means folks stay and they cause bad attitudes for other people. Sometimes it means they leave, right? Low engagement teams, 18 to 43% higher turnover than highly engaged teams. What does that mean? If you're a people manager who's really good at keeping your folks engaged, you may not have seen the turnover and the attrition that other folks are seeing, but a highly disengaged team, 18 to 43% more likely to be actively job hunting. So where that sort of puts us, I think, is at a central problem. And I want to kind of like maybe qualitatively summarize what I think the problem is, at least from my standpoint. And I think what the problem really is, if I can describe it in a sentence, is that there is a mismatch between the job environment that employees actually want and the one that their organizations have. What I want from my workplace could be very disconnected to what my organization is offering. And that gap is a really big deal, because the wider that gap is, the more I might actively be on the job hunt. And there are so many reasons that we could dig into why this is happening. But I think one of the ones I really want to kind of zero in on is the fact that we as employees, our needs have changed. Our needs from the workplace, what we expect from our workplace, notice the language there, what employees expect, has changed. And there's a good reason for it. The reason is we are now fundamentally different. And, it's hard to quantify how we've changed in the last 2 years, but let's take a little bit of a stab at it. So I want you to kind of think of these in terms of just size, the numbers. 9 million Americans lost a family member to COVID. I know I'm in that bucket, and I'm sorry if you are as well. 22 million jobs were lost. 8 million Americans fell into poverty. We're talking about the impact to the American people in the 12 to 24 months that have come out. And of course, I say American people realizing there was a global impact, but I'm quantifying it as American people because of the statistics that I'm offering you are based in the US. We also had to do a lot of adapting in terms of work. At one point, 83% of us were working remotely, sometimes completely unexpectedly. And then comes this part of the psychology of disruption. All of these things, fear, trauma, psychological shock, distress, prolonged stress, anxiety, all of these are up. 1 out of every 2 Americans had a mental health crisis within the last 12 to 24 months. Depression is up by 30% from pre-pandemic levels. And there are a lot of psychologists, there are a lot of neuroscientists who will tell you that when this level of trauma occurs, our brains actually rewire. That's why so much of the research out there that's been calling this the Great Resignation, there have been other people who have been saying, no, it's not just about resignation, it's the Great Reevaluation, it's the Great Rethink. And all of these different names are attempting to get at this. They're attempting to get at the reality that we are fundamentally different and we cannot return to being who we were pre-pandemic just because offices are back in motion, or just because it's time to go back to the office, for example. I like the way New York Times says it here. The psychology of disruption cannot be underestimated. COVID will be an era. It will not be a crisis that actually fades. And so as we bring that down to the context of the workplace, what are we doing about all of this? I think this is the challenge. As a people, many of us would say some level of returning to normal is a statement that resonates with us. We would like to return to normal in some fashion. The problem is that if this is your strategy as a company for embracing the workforce, coming back to work, or embracing how are you going to support your workers from here on out, that strategy falls completely short, because what it does is it actually neglects the fact that employees have fundamentally changed, their needs have changed. And in fact, unfortunately, there's a growing body of research that's showing this is exactly what organizations are doing. They're trying desperately to ignore that we've become fundamentally different humans, and they're sort of holding their breath for returning to normal and being able to just go back to how things were January of 2020. And this is what it's doing. Most employers, many employers rather, are handling the situation quite similarly. They are failing to invest in a more fulfilling employee experience. That's your day-to-day, what it's like to work for a company. And they're also failing to meet the new demands for autonomy and flexibility at work. And that creates a really big problem. And sort of my role, how I want to spend the rest of the few minutes with us today, is to talk about flipping that on its head. How do we reimagine the workplace experience to better support employees and teams? And I'll encapsulate this with kind of two of my favorite quotes that have come out recently. One is McKinsey says, this is it. Organizations that learn why employees are leaving, what they're looking for, and then act thoughtfully, those are going to be the ones that are going to recruit and retain their people. And then I came across this statement, which I thought was sort of grand and philosophical by Forbes. They said, this pivotal moment in history is taking the workforce in a positive direction. And I was tantalized and I kept reading, and they said, this pivotal moment is going to lead to flexibility and skills-based hiring and more training opportunities and a chance to re-engage from a place of trust. And of course, the consultant in me said, well, maybe. right? If folks connect the dots and seize the opportunity, then of course we can use this pivotal moment in history to be able to do that. So I hope that I've interested you at least a little bit on how you might rethink some of the workplace experiences at work and maybe kind of kick back on some of that knee-jerk reaction of returning to normal. Let me give you instead some ways that maybe you want to question normal and do something a little bit different. So here's where I want to zero in on people-focused strategies. And I want to look specifically at 3 areas where I think every organization needs to be reimagining their workplace right now. That's employee flexibility, employee engagement, and employee development. Now, understandably, these are pretty big buckets, and I'm going to do my best to try to talk to salient points within these, but I think they're the right buckets. And what I mean by that is for all of the things that we don't know, remember I mentioned earlier that businesses not knowing what people are running from and running to, that's very risky. Well, for all the things that we don't know, these are things I'm telling you saliently keep recurring in the research as areas that move the needle for employee recruitment, retention, satisfaction, engagement, productivity, all the wonderful things that organizations want. These are the inroads to actually get there. And what you're going to find as I start going through some of these is even though I've kind of called these 3 separate things, I think you're going to start to notice that they kind of blend a little bit. There's parts that sort of bleed into each other. And that's intentional, right? Because you don't have sort of compartmentalized employees. We are one whole person. So let's look at that. We'll start off with the one that I think is the easiest for all of us to grasp, and that's the idea of flexibility. Flexibility at its basis is give me flexibility of where I work, give me flexibility of when I work. The reason that this is particularly important right now is really pretty astounding. So on the one hand, we had 45% of people who left the workforce last year say lack of flexibility for choosing when I work my hours. That was one of the reasons that I had to leave. Notice that for there, it's when, not just where, but there's both a when and a where of work. And then you might say, and I've heard leaders say, oh, well, but they're going to discover that the grass is not greener on the other side and they're going to come back. Well, let's take a look at that. In fact, in a research study that was just published last month, 1 out of every 2 of those people who left in 2021 said, I now have flexibility of when I work and where I work. And get this, I am seeing improved work-life balance because of it. So maybe the grass was a little bit greener on the other side. Also, major recruiters are saying right now, and I love the way this particular statement came out, almost 0% of the people are interested in 100% back in the office. And that flies in the face of what I'm seeing a lot of companies do right now, which is just reverting to back in the office work. This one really sort of hit me in particular. 1 out of every 2 employees is stating that the loss of flexibility is their greatest fear about returning to in-person work. Get this, second only to COVID. Now, I've had COVID. I've had family members who had COVID, and it's a scary thing. I totally understand that. And I can tell you that if second only to that, there is a fear in employees right now, and loss of flexibility is that fear. What does that say for us as organizations in terms of how there's an opportunity for us to move the needle on the second greatest fear that employees have right now, right? You as a company, you as a people manager, you may not feel you can do anything about COVID. I get that. I feel that, I feel that way too, but you can do something about that loss of flexibility fear, which is probably why Forbes and other companies are saying of everything you could do for your employees right now, flexibility is the most empowering thing you can give them. Flexibility of when and where. Let's continue to dig into this one. So here's what I find interesting. I've talked with a lot of leaders recently who say, oh, well, you know what, though? I just feel like this is all so sudden, like we had to react to flexible work arrangements so quickly. And we sort of made do, Rachel, but I'm not sure that we're ready to commit to this in an ongoing basis. And to that, I just want to remind folks there is a lengthy history to flexible work arrangements. In fact, I started working 100% remotely in early 2000s, and I became very interested in remote work, and I started doing research on it. And one of the things that I did is I did a presentation in 2008, spurred by SHRM work, where they said, it's official, flexible work arrangements, they are surging across the workplace. And they said 68% of it is coming because the employees are asking for it. 55% is because the employees need an ability to have control over their work-life balance. And the other 50%, well, that's because we want to cast wide nets and we want to be able to attract and retain the best people. It doesn't matter if they're based in Denver, if they're based in Miami, we want to attract and retain them. This is 14 years ago, guys. A couple of years later, I watched a White House address that said, we need 21st century workplaces that adapt and that offer flexibility to employees. 2010. In 2012, Stanford published and said, hey, is there a loss for organizations if employees start working flexibly, choosing their own location and hours? What they found out is it's actually not just revenue neutral, it's positive. Employee happiness goes up, employee productivity goes up. By 2016, 1 out of every 5 employees, think about that, was working 100% remotely. I weeded out people working 80% remotely, 60%, 50%, 25%. This is 100% remote workers, already 1 in 5 by 2016. And I was in that bucket, as I mentioned before. By 2017, journals were starting to say close to 1 out of every 2 employees is seeing this remote work option as a must. And then I remember when Deloitte published their 2018 on the future of work, and they said a couple of things. They said, hey, everybody, face-to-face collaboration, that's on the decline, and it's expected to continue on the decline. And video conferencing, remote collaboration, we think that's going to grow by 70% in 3 to 5 years. Funnily enough, right at the end of their prediction, here comes a pandemic, and we all came to know 2020 as the year of Zoom, didn't we? And then by 2018, folks like myself who work in training and development, we had already realized the power of technology. So 69% of our training and development was leveraging technology in one way or another. Either we were delivering content hybrid, we were doing Zoom video trainings, etc. I had a couple of clients in 2020 and 2021 say, hey, have you thought about doing virtual workshops? It'd be really nice if you could. And I chuckled and I said, we've been delivering virtual workshops since the early 2000s. I remember building online courses when you had to know things like HTML and WYSIWYG editors, and now things are just so radically different, right? But think about this, grasp the amount of time that we've had as a workplace to embrace flexible work arrangements. In 2019, I did a presentation and I led with Cisco's decision to go fully remote, fully flexible work. You choose when you put in your hours. You choose where in the world you want to work. And they said, not only did we save $500 million in real estate costs, but bonus, employee satisfaction went up. And now you fast forward, and I pull up my phone a couple of days ago, and I hope you saw this too. Airbnb CEO says, hey, everybody, in the midst of your employers requiring you to come back to work, let me put out an APB. Airbnb wants remote workers. You choose where you want to work. You choose when you want to work. What happened? 800,000 visitors flooded the Airbnb job site. I mean, you talk about like great marketing, right? Great ideas on how to bring people. And this was not just, of course, I mean, we're all hoping this wasn't just some PR stunt. This is changing the workplace to be able to meet the changing needs of the employees. Now, here's the problem. In as much as I just showed you 14 years of evidence, there's still a very big gap. I'm working with leaders every single day who are still resisting any form of significant flexible work arrangements. In many cases, the closest they can get to is, well, we'll take 1 day and we'll make that your work from home day, or maybe 2 days and we'll make that your work from home day. And what's sort of crippling too is, even though we spent 24 months in the pandemic and lockdown showing that it could work, only 22% of American workers said their managers trust them to be productive when they can't see them, right? When they're working remotely. And then this absolutely floored me. 77%, this just came out last month, 77% of US managers said, I'm prepared to fire people, cut their pay, or limit their promotion if they don't come back to the office and they continue to work remotely. And to me, as someone who's been studying remote work since the early 2000s, this is crushing. And I can only imagine how it feels to the employees who just proved they could work remotely for all of this time, right? And so this is kind of the delta. This is where we need to go. We need to realize that flexibility is the new norm. It's part of the new employee work contract. Those employee work contracts, you've heard them called social contracts, psychological contracts. It's just something that says what I expect from you as my employer, what you as my employer expect from me. Well, that is, flexibility is now part of that. And really, we're needing to adapt our businesses more than we've done so to really meet that need. And I just want to remind us here, there was a study that was even done by Mustaine just this year, who found out that when you give employees agency, when you give them decision-making power over when do I work, how do I get my work done, and even how much, they end up working more. They're more efficient. They're more productive. In fact, remote workers spend more time working and they're more effective at working than their in-office counterparts, who oftentimes in those traditional office settings face a tremendous amount of disruptions and interruptions. We published a blog some time ago, it was on extroversion and introversion. And one of the things that I shared at that moment is that I was starting in my early 20s in my career, and I took on this job with a really great organization. And the month that I took it on, they decided to tear down walls and cubicles and create one big open office environment. And they thought it was glorious. They thought it was going to just create collaboration and stir conversations. I, as somebody with a preference for introversion, and I need focus in my day, I even need lower lighting, etc. To me, it was an entirely disruptive workplace. And I had many conversations with my manager about it, and he wasn't comfortable at the time letting me work remotely until one day I walked into his office and I said, do you know what happened yesterday? I counted the number of times that my head went up from my workstation to look at somebody walking by, going to the copier, going to the refrigerator, going to the bathroom, and I was interrupted over 500 times yesterday. And if you quantify that, he was a big quantifiable guy. If you quantify that to, it takes a person 5 to 10 minutes to regain their focus when they've been disrupted or interrupted. And it's going to take me 5 to 10 minutes to get back to the task at hand. And I'm doing that 500 times a day. I'm really doing you a disservice here. And this workplace is doing a disservice. Well, thankfully, that was a very pivotal moment, and I ended up getting leadership support, and so began my journey of working 100% remotely from that point. But the point stands that sometimes our workplaces are not built to help our employees thrive. And that goes both ways, for the manager as well as for the employee. We don't want to force managers to actually support employees remotely if they don't have the skills to do that. So let's actually talk about that in just a moment. So here's what I want to give you, a couple of recommendations on this sort of journey towards flexibility. And I like to say here, beyond the tech, right? Because I read a study the other day that said something like technology is powering the move to remote work. And I sort of chuckled because technology doesn't really empower, right, broad changes and sweeping changes in workplace policy. It's really supposed to make the policy, you're supposed to create the policy first, right? And then find the tools and the tech to support it. So let's think beyond. Do you have the technology to be remote? Do you have the technology for flexible work? And let's talk about the philosophies and the policies and the practices that are going to make it happen. The first one, inescapable, is building top-level support. If your organization has not already broadly embraced flexible work arrangements, that's a really good place to start. And in part, it's because if I'm a people manager, take a look at that last sentence. I'm having so many conversations right now with managers that say, Rachel, I feel stuck. I feel stuck because I know my employees. I know that they're having work-life balance issues. I know that they need flexibility. And even if I was okay offering it, my organization isn't really supporting me. Or maybe the organization is kind of okay with me doing it, but just don't ask for permission, more of a sort of keep it under the down low type thing. Or maybe the organization has said, okay, yes, manager, you are empowered to create flexible work arrangements, but the manager, he or she, right, they are not ready to know how to actually do it. In tandem with this, I think, is creating a flexibility positive culture. And what's really meant by that is a flexibility positive culture is more than just saying you get to work from home 2 days a week. There are so many forms of flexibility. It can take the form of things like you choose location independence. You can choose your arrival or your departure time. Maybe you have more control over the shifts that you take on. Maybe there are employees that you have at your organization who want to stay a part of it, don't want to leave, but they're struggling to have work-life balance. And maybe for them, a part-time role or a job share would be better. I just heard a tech talk, probably for the fourth time, Juliet Shore on the solution of the 4-day work week. And if you have not seen that, that is such a good use of 13 minutes of your time, compressed work weeks. She's actually looking at the fact that all of this pandemic stress, resiliency issues, burnout issues, issues of even climate change, the answer in many cases can be a compressed 4-day work week. That doesn't always mean 4/10s. Some organizations are championing the way where it means 32 hours and you still get the full pay because they're starting to realize that when they instituted these systems, everything that the organization wants and everything that the employee wants both merged. So as an example, there's a CEO, Adam Husney, who said in June, we were having so many people exit our organization, we had to do something. And kudos to them that they did, because a lot of organizations wouldn't necessarily know what to do yet. Well, by August, they had instituted compressed work weeks. And what they ended up finding out is a couple of things went up and a couple of things went down. Productivity went up, revenue went up, customer satisfaction went up. And what went down was resignations, use of sick days, absenteeism, and reported well-being issues by employees. Really fascinating. And I work with a lot of global organizations, and this is not just a US thing, right? Iceland, Spain, Scotland, they have been doing these things with government subsidy as well, and they can be pretty powerful. In tandem with that, I think there are some organizations where they offer flexibility, but it's kind of a no-no for you to use that on a very regular basis. And there, what I'd like to have you think about is how much do you need to change your culture so that there is not a stigma associated with using flexibility. So what I mean by that is I've worked with people managers who have a bias for collaborating and running to the people who are co-located in the office with them. And they forget about remote employees. They pass up remote employees for promotions. They don't give the high stakes projects to remote employees. There's a real stigma around that. And you need to work on those things at your organization if it's truly going to be the freeing type of environment where you give employees control over their work-life balance. And this is really needed across all levels, right? Not just top down, but really at that people manager level. And then a lot of organizations moved in this route, but some of them have not, where the incentive, the way that you measure employee performance should at no point be linked to how many hours they work. That is not a good predictor in and of itself of productivity, right? There are so many other ways to align incentives for how we look at employee performance, things like SMART goals. There are ways that we can incentivize productivity, performance, collaboration that does not come across as sort of an inauthentic clock in, clock out. Let's just assume that you're engaged the 40 hours that you're here. And I think that cannot be divorced from developing your managers. I like to say this all the time. The people managers, the leaders, they're the ones that create the day-to-day employee experience, not what the top level leader does, right? So if the manager that I'm working for, as we read earlier, doesn't trust that I'm being productive remotely, that's a good place to start. Show your people managers that the future of work, adapting to flexible work arrangements, that's no longer an optional. That's a requirement at this point. So take a look at that. Something else that I think is very challenging is that kind of bottom of the iceberg type thing. You're not going to hear oftentimes your people managers say this, but when I dig in with some of the people managers, I end up discovering that they don't always feel confident in their skills or abilities to lead from a distance, to be inspirational and to coach employees with disconnected work environments. But they may not come out and say that, right? They may have attitudinal sort of disagreement with flexible work, or they may want to support flexible work, but not have the connective tissue to the skills. So I coach leaders, and what I hear them say all the time is, I want to create meaningful connection with my remote employees, but it's coming across as micromanaging. It's coming across as heavy-handed because I don't know how to strike the balance between staying connected, being available, having an open door policy, connecting with them. It's coming across as inauthentic. So those are things that I think you can really think about and work on. And for sure, not an exhaustive list, right? But really just sort of things that I'm hearing in the pulse of the conversations that I'm having. Let's look at the second one. This is a big one, employee engagement. And I think, again, we're looking at where are the areas that you can make investments that will move the needle on employee satisfaction, retention, engagement, etc. Let's take a look here. Quick reminder, 66% of us feel disengaged at work. That's already a huge issue. Of those of us that are disengaged, 73% are therefore looking for a new job somewhere else. And you're kind of lucky if that's happening, because if I stay behind and I'm disengaged, well, the outcome of that might actually be quite worse. Remember, I'm bringing this back from a former slide. If I'm disengaged and I stay, I'm less productive. I have more absenteeism. I may increase your customer complaints. I will bring down morale and team performance by 30 to 40%, right? Absolutely staggering. So here's what I want to do for culture or for engagement. Engagement is so big, I want to focus in on 3 areas that I see right now pertinent to employee engagement. I want to look at well-being, company culture, and looking at your leaders and managers. So join me in kind of looking at those, even though we know that engagement encompasses more than this. Let's kind of take a look at all of them. The first one is, I see a gap, and it's sort of an employee well-being gap. And here's what I mean by that. There was a study done that said, if you as an employee believe that your organization truly cares about your well-being, this is what happens. You are 69% less likely to be looking for another job, 71% less likely to report burnout, 3 times more likely to be engaged at work, and you are 5 times more likely to say to other people, come work here, it's awesome, right? Which supports recruitment and supports attrition. So all that's great. What's the problem? The problem is that we think we're there and we're not often there. There's a pretty big gap. As of March of this year, fewer than 1 in 4 employees would say that their organization cares about their well-being. This is the lowest percentage in nearly 1 decade. And when you grasp that, when you grasp the fact of how much we have changed in the last 24 months, the psychological disruption and stress that we've been through, and to match that with saying we're at the lowest point of employee sentiments for their organization caring about their well-being, that's a really good place to start. That's a really, really good place to make investments. And let's look at what that looks like. So there was a study where employees were asked, how can your organization support your well-being? I want you to kind of think about that. If you and I were sitting next to each other and I said, what do you think your organization could do to support employee well-being? I don't know if you would have predicted this, but take a look at what employees said. 94% of them said, give me flexible work hours. 91% said, give me the choice to work from where I want to work. Isn't that interesting? Because I can tell you from a lot of organizational conversations that I have, well-being is kind of bucketed as like a mental health HR responsibility, and it aligns to things like employee assistance programs, right? Or those kinds of hotlines where you could call and get some support. They're not always aligned to, can I work when and where I want to. And here's where the disconnect comes in. How does that compare to the number of organizations that are offering some level of flexible work? Unfortunately, far lower. This is also worth a read, State of Workplace Empathy Report. And the reason that this matters is because for employees, flexibility isn't just a nice to have. It's not just about where and when of work. It actually connects to my well-being and my mental health. That's why it's an empowering benefit, because it gives me more control over my work and life if you offer me that flexibility. Let's look at the second area. So we're on area number 2. We looked at well-being, we're going to look at culture, and then we're going to look at people managers. Here too, I see a little bit of an impetus for change, and here's what I'm seeing. 82% of employees are saying, you know what, I would rather go to a different organization if I knew they were more empathetic organization. Also, high performer employees. Think of your problem solvers, your constant innovators. They're saying top 5 reason why I would leave, I'm not being recognized or rewarded. This is a problem of the organizational culture, right? There was a study done by MIT Sloan last year, and here's what they found out. A toxic corporate culture, 10 times more predictive of whether I will leave than pay. So when we looked at that very first slide, and the chief economist for ZipRecruiter is saying organizations are trying to increase wages and attract people through wages. And I said to you, table stakes aren't always enough anymore. This is a reason why I'm saying that, because 10 times more important than pay is whether I feel like I work for a toxic culture. And again, this is where I truly wish we were sitting around a table and I could probe you guys and I could say, what do you think is a toxic culture? Because I will admittedly say, when I read that statement, I thought the worst. I was thinking of the kind of workplace that you might see in a crazy sitcom. And I was thinking, unethical behavior, possibly harassment issues, those kinds of things. And I was floored to discover that what employees meant by toxic culture is that the organization was failing to invest in diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is a flooring reality, right? If your organization has not prioritized inclusive teams, inclusive leadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion, every employee feeling appreciated, recognized, valued for who they are and what they value, not just the task at hand, that equates a toxic culture for employees. And 57% of them said, I left because I felt disrespected. That's a toxic culture. And so there's really sort of evidence here to show us then that 2022 really is a year for us to work on workplace culture. But here's the problem, and this is kind of leading up to some recommendations I'm going to give you in a moment. I talk with leaders day in and day out, and none of them disagree that culture is important. The problem is that that's where the disagreement ends. Most of the time when I ask them, what is company culture? How is your company culture different? Tell me about your company culture. What I end up getting is kind of we're all culture is very special. We're very unique. And when you dig into that, there's very little specificity beyond we're special and we're unique. And that's really a problem, because if we don't know what a healthy culture is, how on earth are we going to go about creating it, right? How are we going to create that common understanding, that psychological safety, that reward and recognition that employees are craving in a fulfilling job experience? And so what we really need to focus on is a people-centered program approach. And there's multiple research agencies that are coming out with this, and they're saying top for 2022, DE&I strategies. So people-focused strategies, D&I at the front and center. And we'll talk about that in just a moment when I'll give you some recommendations. Okay, so let's look at the third one. I promised you we were going to disaggregate employee engagement in 3 sections. This is the third one, the direct manager effect. If you've heard any time that I've ever presented, I always say, sometimes I feel like a lot of what we discuss comes back to leaders. And I want to always signal this to say, I'm not one of those folks who just blanketly says, well, because the leader is in charge, then the buck stops with them. The problem is that it's hard to negate compelling evidence. So for example, the impact of the direct manager on employee engagement. If I were to ask you right now, what percentage of the employee experience do you think belongs to the manager? What would you say, I wonder? The research shows 70% of the variance between team engagement is determined, check out the word, solely by the manager, solely by the manager. And all this little other 30%, that's everything else the organization does. That's the perks, that's the pay, that's the HR strategies. But at the end of the day, 70% is the direct manager, which of course in a moment we're going to talk then, are you equipping your managers? And here too, I see a little bit of a disconnect, and it's kind of a big one. So take a look at this. McKinsey did a study. They brought in 80,000 leaders, and they just asked the question, hey leaders, your responsibility is employee engagement. How do you think you're doing on that? Leaders said, 77% of them said, totally good. I'm doing well on creating engaged people, productive teams. Flip that question, same question, employees. How do you think your leaders are doing at creating engaged, productive employees? Similar statistic, but in the wrong direction. 82% of employees said, my leader, not so good at this, not so good at engaging me, engaging our team, and creating productive employees and teams, which is probably why we're starting to see more and more research say, are people leaving their bosses or are they leaving the workplace? And that's because that direct manager to leader relationship can never be overstated in a conversation about employee engagement. So let's put all of these together. What are my recommendations in this area? We want to create an irresistible culture. We want to put culture at the forefront, and that's people-focused strategies, as I mentioned. We want to focus on well-being because flexibility is a nice way that we can do that, and it impacts work-life balance for folks. We want to focus on relational elements like creating inclusive teams and inclusive leaders. We want to develop people managers to know how to engage folks, because look at bullet number 2 there. Yes, 70% of engagement falls to managers, but the skill set to do it is not automatic. So we have to invest in employees and meaningfully recognize them. Let's take a look at this very last one, employee development. I think many of you will suspect this, but it's actually a lever for many things. It's a lever for recruitment because 80% of employees want it. It's a lever for retention because 45% of employees said, give me employee development and I would stay. And it's also a lever for moving the needle on company culture. Isn't it interesting that employees think company culture is most moved by employee development? And of course, what happens when you don't get it? Well, you end up having folks who are willing to leave the organization to find it. So here, I want to also give you some strategies. And we really want to focus on the fact that in order to gain these benefits of a strong learning culture, we have to close the gap between what we're currently doing with training, what we're currently offering, and what organizations actually need to be doing. So for that, let me show you this quick disconnect here. Left-hand side, employers say employee development is taken care of, all set. Right-hand side, employees say, this is what we think of the employee development that's done at our organization. Enthusiastic and off the mark, a tick the box, talk the talk, but don't walk the walk kind of thing. This is a big gap again, right? So we need to do something about this gap. And let me show you a couple of areas where I think you can make some investments and move the needle specifically. So here again, we want to create that learning culture. We want to make it to where even leaders are incentivized to develop people, grow people, retain people, maybe even put people in a different role if they need to. We also want to invest in 2 things for our leaders, and that's emotional intelligence and empathy, because there's 400% less likelihood that you would leave the organization if you report to a manager with high emotional intelligence. So that's a worthwhile area to make investment. We also want to make investments in DE&I because a well-designed DE&I training program drives satisfaction, bottom line business success, and ultimately performance of employees. And then even the Myers-Briggs company did a study where we asked employees, how did self-awareness and professional development, when it was meaningful, what did it help you do? And this is everything they said. It helped me work better with others. It helped me cope with stress. It helped me deliver better results for clients. It helped me better know how to manage other people. So we want to make sure that employee development isn't something that we're just leaving to HR, or we're just leaving as kind of, do you have a catalog of things, yes or no? There's a lot more sort of thoughtful work that can be done in the space of employee development. So with that, I just want to kind of end here and pass it back over to Deb and see if we have any questions. And I just want to remind folks, again, these were big, broad buckets, and I threw a lot of information at you, but really the opportunity is for us to realign ourselves, because the truth is that employees wanted flexibility and engagement and development pre-pandemic. And now there's an acceleration. They expect more. That employee work contract has totally shifted. Let's see, Deb, did you see anything interesting come into the chat? Anything folks wanted to bring up?
Sure. Thank you so much, Rachel. Well, first of all, let me say thank you. That was a great presentation. Not only great details, but so engagingly presented. We don't have a lot of time, but there's one intriguing question that did come through, and that was about your thoughts on whether organizations need to work on their own compassion fatigue.
That's interesting. So it is a tough one. You know what I think is so hard? I'm not sure that there's an answer, but I will say this, it's not easy to get at that. And what I mean by that is I've been working with an organization recently, and our mission was to find out the attitudes of leaders regarding inclusion, for example. So much harder than you think that is, right? Because attitudes, perceptions, values, they're oftentimes harder for us to get to know about people. So I'm afraid we may not have a very elegant answer for you other than to say it's probably highly subjective. I suspect that there are people on your organization who feel more apt to do that. And then there's probably managers like the ones I'm coaching who say, I used to get away with not talking about compassion, mental health, or empathy at all before. I expected people to walk into the workplace and check their personal needs at the door, and I can't do that anymore, Rachel. Like, what do I do? And we're starting to realize then that empathy and emotional intelligence, these are not ideas that came up in the 80s or 90s and they're no longer buzzwords. They're very much for the moment.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's very insightful, and especially given the context that you said about organizations changing, and we really don't know the answer why people are resigning. We have some suppositions, but it's a lot more complex. So again, thank you so much for a great presentation. Very much want to thank you. And I want to thank everybody for coming today as well. And in fact, if you've enjoyed today's program, please make sure that you visit the conferenceboard.org/webcast to see a full roster of upcoming webcasts. Let me draw your attention to the very first one on human capital perspectives, the reimagined workplace 2 years later. That's one this coming Thursday. I'm actually one of the presenters with Robin Erickson from the Conference Board. So please make it a point to join that one. But I also want to say that in addition, we have CEO's Perspectives. It's a new monthly podcast that we're offering. They're no more than 30 minutes. They present a curated list of top insights that are really created over the past month by the center and by each center, by the Conference Board. And the podcast is actually hosted by CEO Steve Odland, and the content is aimed at CEOs and their direct reports. So please listen and subscribe to the podcast wherever you find your own podcasts. Second, I want to also call your attention to MyTCB. We're very proud to announce that we've just recently launched this, and it's a new member-only website that offers members a curated and very personalized view of the full range of not just membership benefits that are available, but also the research that we've done, the insights that we offer, events, data, benchmarking tools, peer networks, access to experts in one centralized place. And then the final thing I want to mention, and this again is very new, this is, as geopolitical tensions rise, companies are really facing a very daunting environment. And the Conference Board's new Geopoliticals Hub offers trusted insights for navigating this turbulent landscape. The hub actually provides information on what the latest developments in the Ukraine mean for the business environment. Taking a 360 approach, the Conference Board explores what the upended geopolitical terrain means for public policy, for marketing, for ESG, and human capital. And that concludes our today's webcast. Thanks again so much for joining us, and thank you, Rachel. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye, everyone.